Hello everybody, I hope you're all having a wonderful day or night, whatever time it happens to be, wherever you are in the world. My name is Jay, and welcome to episode 6 of History's Hangnails, the podcast where we deep dive on bizarre events and mysteries from our past. Today's episode takes us back to the 1840s. In the United States, there was a dramatic increase in settlers leaving their homes in the East to then resettle in the Oregon Territory or California, both at the time accessible only by a very long sea voyage or a daunting overland journey across the perilous American frontier. Some saw California as a place where they would be free to live in a fully Catholic culture, while others were attracted to the economic opportunities the West could provide, or inspired by the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the land between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans belonged to European Americans and that they should settle there. Most wagon trains followed the Oregon Trail route from a starting point in Independence, Missouri, to the continental divide of the Americas, the principal and largely mountainous formations that separate the drainage basins flowing into the Atlantic, Arctic, and Pacific Oceans respectively. Folk usually travelled about 24 kilometres a day on a journey that took between 4 and 6 months, following rivers to South Pass, a mountain pass in what is now Wyoming, which allowed relatively easy navigation for the wagons. From there, pioneers had a choice of several different routes that led to their destination. In 1842, Lansford Hastings, an early migrant from Ohio to the west, went to California, having seen the potential of the undeveloped country. To encourage others, he published a book called The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. As an alternative to the route through Idaho's Snake River Plain, a common choice for most travelers, he proposed a more direct journey to California across the Great Basin. This route would take travelers through the Wasatch Ridge, a mountain range in the western United States running about 260 kilometers from the Utah-Idaho border south to central Utah and across the Great Salt Lake Desert. Of course, the man himself had never taken this route he claimed was more direct, and this shortcut Hastings proposed added 32 kilometers on top of the already lengthy journey. It wasn't until early 1846 that he attempted this route on a trip from California to Fort Bridger, a fur trading outpost run by Jim Bridger and his partner Louis Vasquez, and established on Black's Fork of the Green River in what is now Uinta County, Wyoming. Hastings stayed at the fort to persuade travelers to turn south onto his route, though he had little success. As of 1846, Hastings was the second of 2 men documented to have crossed the southern part of the Great Salt Lake Desert, though neither of them had been accompanied by wagons. The last 160 kilometers across the Sierra Nevada mountain range was certainly the most difficult part of the journey to California. Boasting approximately 500 distinct peaks reaching over 3,700 meters high, which, because of their height and proximity to the Pacific Ocean, receive more snow than most other ranges in North America. The eastern side of the range is also notoriously steep. It was vital while traveling these routes the timing of any expeditions be carefully planned. Leaving Missouri to cross the vast wilderness to Oregon or California, travelers often ran the risk of being bogged down by the mud from the spring rains or by massive snowdrifts in the mountains from September onwards. Any animals these travelers had with them, such as horses and oxen, would also need a steady supply of grass to graze on, making a mistimed trip deadly for not only the pioneers, but also their livestock and means of carrying their supply wagons. In the spring of 1846, almost 500 wagons headed west from Independence. At the rear of the train, a group of 9 wagons, containing 32 members of the Reed and Donner families, including their employees, would depart on May 12. George Donner, born in North Carolina, had gradually moved west to Kentucky, Indiana, and eventually Illinois, taking a one-year sojourn in Texas. He was around 60 years old at the time of the journey, and with him was his 44-year-old wife, Tamsin, their 3 daughters, 6-year-old Frances, 4-year-old Georgia, and 3-year-old Eliza, as well as George's daughters from a previous marriage, 14-year-old Elitha and 12-year-old Liana. George's younger brother, 56-year-old Jacob, and his wife, 45-year-old Elizabeth, joined the party with stepsons 14-year-old Solomon Hook and 12-year-old William Hook. They also had with them their 5 children, 9-year-old George, 7-year-old Mary, 6-year-old Isaac, 4-year-old Lewis, and 1-year-old Samuel. A group of Teamsters also travelled with the families, including 29-year-old Hiriam O. Miller, Samuel Shoemaker, Noah James, Charles Berger, John Denton, and Augustus Spitzer. 45-year-old Ireland-born James F. Reed was accompanied by his wife, 32-year-old Margaret, their stepdaughter, 13-year-old Virginia, daughter, 8-year-old Martha Jane, sons, 5-year-old James and 3-year-old Thomas, and Sarah Keyes, Margaret's mother, who was in the advanced stages of tuberculosis, often referred to at this time as consumption. On May 29, Keyes succumbed to the illness at a campsite they named Alcove Springs. She was buried nearby, off to the side of the trail, with a grey rock as her grave marker. In addition to leaving financial worries behind, Reed had hoped California's climate would help Margaret, who had also long suffered from ill health. The Reeds hired 3 men to drive their ox teams: 28-year-old Milford Elliott, 25-year-old James Smith, and 25-year-old Walter Heron. 24-year-old Bayless Williams went along as a handyman with his sister and the family's cook, 25-year-old Eliza. Within a week of leaving Independence, the 2 families joined a group of 50 other wagons, led by one William H. Russell. By June 16, the company had travelled 720 kilometres, with another 320 kilometres to go before they reached Fort Laramie, experiencing delays due to inclement weather and rising rivers. Several other families would join the wagon train along the way. 37-year-old Lavina Murphy, a widow from Tennessee, headed a family of 13. Her 5 youngest were 16-year-old John Landrum, 14-year-old Miriam, 12-year-old Lemuel, 10-year-old William, and 8-year-old Simon. Lavina's 2 married daughters and their families were also part of this consort, including 19-year-old Sarah Murphy Foster, her husband, 30-year-old William McFadden, and son, 1-year-old Jeremiah George, as well as 18-year-old Harriet Murphy Pike, her husband, 32-year-old William Montgomery, and their daughters, 3-year-old Naomi and 1-year-old Catherine. 28-year-old William H. Eddy, a carriage maker from Illinois, brought his wife, 25-year-old Eleanor, and their 2 children, 3-year-old James and 1-year-old Margaret. The Breen family also joined them, consisting of 51-year-old Patrick Breen, a farmer from Iowa, his wife, 40-year-old Margaret, and their 7 children, 14-year-old John, 13-year-old Edward, 9-year-old Patrick Jr., 8-year-old Simon, 5-year-old James, 3-year-old Peter, and 11-month-old Isabella. Their neighbour, 40-year-old Patrick Dolan, travelled with them, as well as a few smaller parties, such as 32-year-old German immigrant Louis Kesselberg and his wife and daughter, 22-year-old Elizabeth Philippine and 2-year-old Ada. They also had a son born on the trail, who they named Louis Jr. Two young single men named Spitzer and Reinhardt travelled with another German couple, the Wolfingers, who were rumoured to be quite wealthy, and their hired driver, Dutch Charlie Berger. An older man named Hardcoop rode with them. Luke Halloran, a young man sick with consumption, could no longer ride horseback, and his companions no longer had the resources to care for him. Once the Donners had reached Little Sandy River, they took Halloran in, and he rode with them instead. Meanwhile, attempting to promote his alternative route, the Hastings Cutoff, Lansford Hastings sent riders to deliver letters to travelling migrants. On July 12, just a couple of months after they had departed on their journey, the Reed and Donner families would receive one of these letters. Hastings warned that the migrants could expect opposition from the Mexican authorities in California and advised them to band together in large groups. He also claimed to have worked out a new and better road to California, and he said he would be waiting at Fort Bridger to guide them along the cutoff. On July 20, at the Little Sandy River, most of the wagon train opted to follow the already established trail via Fort Hall. A smaller group broke away and decided to head for Fort Bridger, taking Hastings up on his offer. Most of the younger men in this group were European immigrants and were not considered to be ideal or experienced leaders. James Reed, however, had lived in the United States for a considerable time, was older, and he had military experience, though most of the party found him ostentatious due to his autocratic attitude. By comparison, the more mature and charitable nature exhibited by George Donner made him an ideal choice to lead the smaller party. While the members of this party were well off, most of them were inexperienced in long, difficult overland travel and had no clue how to properly communicate with the Native American tribes in the area. Journalist Edwin Bryant reached Black's Fork a week ahead of the Donner Party and moved ahead a short way to examine the new trail proposed by Hastings. He became concerned that it would be too difficult for their wagons to traverse, especially with so many women and children in tow. He returned to Black's Fork to leave letters warning several members of the group not to take Hastings Cutoff, and by the time the Donner Party arrived at Black's Fork on July 27, Hastings had already left, adding led a train of 40 wagons from the Harlan Young group. Because Fort Bridger would surely fare substantially better if people used the Hastings Cutoff due to it taking travellers further south and bypassing Fort Hall, Bridger told the party that the shortcut would provide them a smooth journey, devoid of rugged country and hostile natives. He claimed water would be easily come by along the way, though an approximate 48 to 64 kilometre crossing over a dry lake bed would be necessary. Reed was taken with this good news and advocated for the new route. None of the party received Bryant's letters warning them against this, with Bryant himself believing that the letters were purposefully concealed by Bridger to drive more business to his trading post. Upon reaching Fort Laramie, Reed met an old friend of his named James Kleiman, who was travelling from California. Kleiman also warned Reed not to take the Hastings Cutoff, telling him that wagons would not be able to make the trip and that Hastings' information was wildly inaccurate. On July 31, 1846, the party left Black's Fork after 4 days of rest and wagon repairs, just 11 days behind the Harlan Young group. Donner hired a replacement driver, and the company was joined by the McCutcheon family, consisting of 30-year-old William, his wife, 24-year-old Amanda, their 2-year-old daughter Harriet, and a 16-year-old named Jean-Baptiste Trudeau from New Mexico, who also claimed to have knowledge of the Native Americans and terrain on the route to California. Despite any protest, the party would eventually turn south to follow the Hastings Cutoff. Within only days, they found the terrain to be much more rugged than described. Several years of traffic on the main Oregon Trail had left an easy and obvious path, whereas the Cutoff was mostly unmapped and more difficult to find and stay on. Hastings had written directions to guide other travelers, in the form of letters stuck to trees along the way, though his own inexperience and lack of knowledge made these redundant. On August 6, the party found a letter from him advising them to stop until he could show them an alternate route to that taken by the Harlan Young party. Reed, Charles T. Stanton, and William Pike rode ahead to link up with Hastings, encountering exceedingly rough canyons where boulders had to be moved and rock walls cut off precariously to the river systems below. Certainly an untenable path for wagons, let alone people travelling on foot. In his letter, Hastings had offered to guide the Donner Party around the more difficult areas, but he rode back only part way, indicating the general direction to follow. Stanton and Pike stopped to rest, with Reed returning alone to the group 4 days after the party's departure. Without the guide they had been promised, the group had to decide whether to turn back, rejoin the original trail, and follow the tracks left by the Harlan Young group through Weber Canyon, or forge their own path forward in the vague direction recommended by Hastings. At Reed's request, the group chose the new Hastings route. Their progress slowed to about 2.4 kilometers a day, with the able-bodied among them clearing the brush, felled trees, and large rocks preventing the wagons from coming through. As the Donner Party made its way across the Wasatch Range, they were reached by the Graves family, who had set out to find them. This new group travelled across 3 wagons and consisted of 57-year-old Franklin Graves, his wife, 45-year-old Elizabeth, their children, 22-year-old Sarah, also married, 20-year-old Mary, 18-year-old William, 15-year-old Eleanor, 13-year-old Lavina, 9-year-old Nancy, 7-year-old Jonathan, 5-year-old Franklin Jr., 1-year-old Elizabeth, and Sarah's son-in-law, 23-year-old Jay Fostick. Also with them was a 25-year-old teamster named John Snyder. Their arrival brought the total number of the Donner Party to 87 members, travelling with 60 to 80 wagons. By August 20, they had reached a point in the mountains where they could look down and see the Great Salt Lake. It took them almost another 2 weeks to travel out of the Wasatch Range. People were now becoming agitated and unsure. Food and supplies also ran dangerously low for some of the less affluent families. The men began arguing, and doubts were expressed about the wisdom of those who had chosen this route, in particular, James Reed. After the initial scouting party had departed, with only Reed returning at first, the main group would eventually find the other two, only one desperate day away from deciding to eat their horses to stay alive. On August 25, Luke Halloran succumbed to his illness and died. A few days later, the party came across a torn and tattered letter from Hastings. The pieces indicated there were 2 days and 2 nights of difficult travel ahead without grass or water. They rested their oxen, preparing for the next leg of their journey, and after 36 hours, set off to traverse the 300-meter mountain that lay in their path. From its peak, they could see ahead of them a dry, barren plain, perfectly flat and covered with white salt, even larger than the one they had just crossed. Their oxen were already fatigued, and water was scarce. On August 30, the party pressed onward, seeing no better alternative. In the heat of the day, the moisture underneath the salt crust rose to the surface, turning it into a gummy mass and causing the wagon wheels to sink into the softened ground, in some cases up to the hubs. The days were blisteringly hot and the nights frigid. Several of the group claimed to see visions of lakes and wagon trains, believing they had finally overtaken Hastings. After 3 more days, their water was completely gone, and some of the party had removed their oxen from the wagons, hoping to find more water by scouting ahead in smaller groups. Some of their animals were in such a weakened state that they were left yoked to wagons and abandoned. 9 of Reed's 10 oxen broke free, crazed with thirst, and bolted off into the desert. Many other families' cattle and horses had also gone missing. This part of the journey resulted in irreparable damage to some of the wagons, though with the exception of Halloran, who was already afflicted with tuberculosis, no human lives had yet been lost. While the journey over this new route was promised to have them travelling 64 kilometres in 2 days, the trip instead took 6 days, covering 130 kilometres. The party no longer had any faith in the Hastings Cutoff. They spent several days trying to recover their cattle, retrieve the wagons left in the desert, and transfer any food and supplies they had left into other wagons. Reed's family incurred heavy losses, and Reed himself became more assertive, asking all the families to present an inventory of their supplies to him. Having heard that John Sutter was exceedingly generous to pioneers, he suggested that 2 men should go to Sutter's fort in California to acquire more provisions. Charles Stanton and William McCutcheon volunteered to undertake the dangerous trip. The remaining serviceable wagons were pulled by mongrel teams of cows, oxen, and mules. It was now mid-September, and 2 more of their group who had journeyed out ahead in search of missing oxen reported that another 64 kilometres of desert lay ahead of them. Their cattle and oxen were now exhausted and lean, but the Donner Party crossed the next stretch of desert relatively unscathed. The journey seemed to get easier, particularly through the valley next to the Ruby Mountains, a mountain range in Nevada primarily located within Elko County and extending into White Pine County. Despite their near hatred of Hastings, they had no choice but to attempt to follow his tracks, which were weeks old by this stage. On September 26, 2 months after embarking on the new route, the Donner Party finally rejoined the traditional trail along a stream that became known as the Humboldt River. Overall, this alternate route extended their journey by a month. Along the Humboldt, the group met Paiute Native Americans, a tribe that lived in the Great Basin region of the United States in what is now eastern California, western Nevada, and southeast Oregon. They joined the party for a couple of days, but ended up either stealing or shooting several horses and oxen. By now, it was well into October, and the Donner families decided to split off from the larger group once more to make better time. 2 wagons in the remaining group became tangled, and John Snyder began to beat the ox of Reed's hired teamster out of anger. When Reed intervened, Snyder proceeded to hit him in the head with a whip handle. Reed's wife then attempted to step in, also being struck with the whip handle several times. Reed retaliated by fatally plunging a knife into Snyder's chest, right underneath his collarbone. That evening, witnesses gathered to discuss what was to be done. United States laws were not applicable west of the Continental Divide in what was then Mexican territory, and wagon trains often dispensed their own justice. Snyder had been witnessed striking Reed, with others claiming to have seen him striking Margaret shortly after. However, Snyder was popular with the group, whereas Reed was not. Kesselberg suggested that Reed should be hanged, but an eventual compromise allowed him to leave the camp without his family, who were to be taken care of by the others. Reed departed alone the next morning, unarmed, though his stepdaughter Virginia rode ahead and secretly provided him with a rifle and supplies. The trials that the Donner Party had so far endured resulted in splintered groups, each looking out for themselves and distrustful of the others. Grass was becoming scarce, and the animals were steadily weakening. To relieve the animals' load, everyone was expected to walk. Kesselberg ejected Hardcoop from his wagon, telling the elderly man that he had to walk or die. A few days later, Hardcoop sat next to a stream to examine his feet, finding them so swollen they had split open. He was not seen again by anyone in the group. William Eddy pleaded with the others to search for him, but they all refused, swearing they would waste no more resources on a man who was almost 70 years old. Meanwhile, Reed caught up with the Donners and proceeded with one of his teamsters, Walter Heron. The two shared a horse and were able to cover approximately 40 to 60 kilometers per day. The rest of the party rejoined the Donners, but their hardships continued. Native Americans chased away all of the horses belonging to Graves, and another wagon had to be left behind. With grass still in short supply, the cattle spread out more, which allowed the Paiutes to steal 18 more in a single evening. Several mornings later, they shot another 21. So far, the company had lost nearly 100 oxen and cattle, and they had used most of their rations. Wolfinger decided to stop at the Humboldt Sink to bury the contents of his wagon in a cache, with Reinhardt and Spitzer staying behind to help. They returned without him, reporting they had been attacked by Paiutes, and Wolfinger was killed in the assault. One more stretch of desert lay ahead. The Eddy's oxen were among those killed by the Native Americans, and the family were forced to abandon their wagon, carrying their children and miserable with thirst. Margaret Reed and her family were now also without a wagon, but they soon reached the end of the desert, found the Truckee River, and beautiful, lush country. Despite this blessing, they had little time to rest. The company pressed on to cross the Sierra Nevada before the snows came. Stanton, one of the two who had left a month earlier to seek assistance in California, finally returned to the main group. He brought with him food and mules from Sutter's Fort, as well as 2 Native American guides employed by John Sutter. These Miwok men were known by their Catholic conversion names, Louise and Salvador. Stanton also brought news that Reed and Heron, though haggard and starving, had succeeded in reaching Sutter's Fort in California. Faced with one last push over mountains that were described as much worse than what they had faced in the Wasatch, the remaining members of the Donner Party had to decide whether to forge ahead or rest their cattle. It was October 20, and they had been told the pass would not be snowed in until the middle of November. William Pike had been killed when a gun being loaded by William Foster was fired by mistake, an event that seemed to make the decision for them. Family by family, they resumed their journey. First, the Breens, then the Kesselbergs, Stanton with the Reed family, the Graves, the Murphys, and finally, the Donners. After a few miles of rough terrain, an axle broke on one of their wagons. Jacob and George went into the woods to fashion a replacement, with George receiving a superficial wound to his hand while chiseling the new axle. snow had begun to fall, just as the Breens made their way up a massive, nearly vertical slope, 300 metres to Truckee Lake, and 4.8 kilometres from the summit, camping near a cabin that had been built 2 years earlier by members of the Stevens Townsend Murphy Party. The Eddies and Kesselbergs joined the Breens, attempting to make it over the pass, but they came up against 5 to 10 foot snowdrifts and were unable to find the trail. They turned back for Truckee Lake, and within a day, all the families were camped there except for the Donners, who were 8 kilometres, approximately half a day's journey, below them. 60 members and associates of the Breen, Graves, Reed, Murphy, Kesselberg, and Eddy families had set up by the lake for the winter. 3 widely separated cabins of pine logs served as their homes, with dirt floors and poorly constructed flat rooftops that leaked when it rained. The Breens occupied one cabin, the Eddies and Murphys another, and the Reeds and Graves in the third. Kesselberg built a lean-to for his family against the side of the Breen cabin, and the families used canvas or oxhide to patch the faulty roofs. These cabins also had no windows or doors, only large holes to allow entry. Of the settlers camped here, there were 19 men, 12 women, and 29 children, 6 of whom were toddlers or younger. Further down the trail, closer to Adler Creek, the Donner families hastily constructed tents to house 21 people, including Mrs. Wolfinger, her child, and the Donner's drivers, 6 men, 3 women, and 12 children in all. On the evening of November 4, the snow returned, signalling the beginning of a storm that would last 8 days. By the time the entire party had made camp, very little food remained from the supplies that Stanton had brought back from Sutter's Fort. The oxen were dying, and their carcasses were frozen and stacked. The lake itself was not yet frozen, but the pioneers were unfamiliar with catching lake trout. Eddy, the most experienced hunter in the group, managed to kill a bear, but had little luck after that. The Reed and Eddy families had lost almost everything. Margaret Reed promised to pay double when they got to California for the use of 3 oxen from the Graves and Breen families. Graves charged Eddy $25, what would normally be the cost of 2 healthy oxen, for the carcass of an ox that had already starved to death. Desperation grew, and some reasoned that individuals might succeed in navigating the pass where the wagons could not. They formed small groups and made several attempts, but each time were driven back to the camp by the harsh weather and unwelcoming terrain. Another severe storm lasting over a week blanketed the area with so much snow that the cattle and horses, the group's only remaining food, were lost. Patrick Breen began keeping a diary on November 20. He concerned himself primarily with the weather, marking the storms and how much snow had fallen, gradually beginning to include references to God and religion in his entries. Life at Truckee Lake was miserable at best. The cabins were poorly constructed, cramped, and filthy, with people unable to venture outside for days at a time due to the weather. Diets soon consisted of oxhide, strips of which were boiled to make an unpleasant glue-like jelly. Ox and horse bones were boiled repeatedly to make soup, and became so brittle that they would crumble when chewed. Sometimes, They were also softened by being charred. Slowly but surely, the Murphy children even picked apart the ox-hide rug that lay in front of their fireplace and roasted it to eat. Folk would often catch and eat mice that strayed into their cabins. Many of the people camped here were now weak, bordering on bedridden. Joseph Reinhardt confessed on his deathbed that he had murdered Wolfinger, and George Donner's hand had become infected, which left 4 men to work at the Donner camp. The mountain party at Truckee Lake began to fail. Spitzer died, then Bayless Williams, one of the drivers hired by the Reeds. Franklin Graves fashioned 14 pairs of snowshoes out of oxbows and hide, and on December 16, a party of 17 men, women, and children set out on foot in another attempt to cross the mountain pass. 4 of the men were fathers, and 3 of the women, who were mothers, had to give their children to others in the camp to care for. They packed lightly, taking what had become 6 days' rations, a rifle, a blanket each, a hatchet, and some pistols, hoping to make their way to Bear Valley. This smaller group was later dubbed Forlorn Hope. 2 of the group without snowshoes, Charles Berger and 10-year-old William Murphy, turned back early on. Other members of the party used one of the pack saddles to fashion a pair of snowshoes for 12-year-old Lemuel Murphy on the first evening. The pioneers were malnourished and unaccustomed to camping in 3.7 metre deep snow, and by the 3rd day, most were snowblind, also known as photokeratitis, a painful eye condition caused by exposure of insufficiently protected eyes to ultraviolet rays, resulting in a sort of sunburn of the cornea. The group set out again the morning of December 21, with Stanton having struggled for several days prior. He remained behind, telling the group that he would catch up shortly. 1 year later, his remains were found in that same location. The group was now lost and confused. After 2 more days without food, Patrick Dolan proposed one of them should volunteer to die in order to feed the others. Some suggested a duel, while another account describes an attempt to create a lottery to choose a member to sacrifice. Eddie suggested that they keep moving until someone simply fell, but a blizzard kept them from progressing any further. Antonio, the animal handler, was the first to die, with Franklin Graves passing shortly after. As the storm worsened, Patrick Dolan began to rant deliriously, stripped off his clothes, and ran into the woods. He returned soon after, then died a few hours after that. This bizarre behavior is commonly known as paradoxical undressing, and can occur when a person is exposed to extreme temperatures, often caused by onset of hypothermia. Not long after Dolan had passed, possibly because the children were near death, some of the group began to eat flesh from Dolan's body. Eddie, Salvador, and Luis refused to eat. Lemuel's sister tried to feed some to her brother, but he was unable to eat and was also lost. The next morning, the group stripped the muscle and organs from the bodies, dried them, and took care to ensure that no one would have to eat their relatives. After 3 days' rest, they set off again, searching for the trail. Eddie eventually succumbed to his hunger and ate human flesh, though it did not last long. They began taking apart their snowshoes to harvest the oxhide and discussed killing Luis and Salvador for food. The two men left the group after Eddie quietly warned them of the group's possible intentions. Jay Fosdick died during the night, leaving only 7 members of the party. Eddie and Mary Graves left to hunt, but when they returned with deer meat, Fosdick's body had already been cut apart for food. After several more days, a total of 25 since they had left the lake, they came across Salvador and Luis, who had not eaten for about 9 days and were probably close to death. William Foster shot both men, who were then butchered and dried for easier consumption. Though the murder of the 2 young men was not kept secret, Foster was not blamed for his actions, nor did he suffer any reprisals later in life from authorities, a testament to the lack of value placed on the lives of Native Americans at the time. No more than a few days later, the group stumbled into a Native American settlement, looking so deteriorated that the camp's inhabitants initially fled. The Native Americans gave them what they had to eat, a combination of acorns, grass, and pine nuts. After a few days, with the help of tribe members, Eddie continued on to a ranch in a small farming community at the edge of the Sacramento Valley. A rescue for the other members of the Forward Party was planned, and by January 17, they had found the remaining 6 survivors. Their trip lasted a total of 33 days. At the lakeside camp, Margaret Reed had managed to save enough food for a Christmas pot of soup, to the delight of her children. However, by January, they were facing starvation and considered eating the ox hides that served to patch the roof. Margaret, Virginia, Milt Elliott, and the servant girl, Eliza Williams, attempted to walk out, reasoning that it would be better to try to bring food back than sit and watch the children starve. They were out in the snow for 4 days before having to turn back. Their cabin was now uninhabitable. The oxhide patching had been taken down to piece apart for food, and the family had to move in with the Breens, with their servants moving in with other families. Eventually, the Graves family came to collect on the debt owed by the Reeds, and took the remaining ox hides, leaving them with nothing to eat. Back in October, James Reed had made it out of the Sierra Nevada to Rancho Johnson in Yuba County. He was safe and recovering at Sutter's Fort, but each day became more concerned for the fate of his family and fellow travelers. He pleaded with Colonel John C. Fremont to gather a team of men to cross the pass and help to recover the company. In return, Reed promised to join Fremont's forces and fight in the Mexican-American War. He was joined by McCutcheon, who had been unable to return with Stanton, as well as some members of the Harlan Young Party, whose wagon train had arrived at Sutter's Fort on October 8, the last to make it over the Sierra Nevada that season. They brought with them roughly 30 horses and a dozen men carrying supplies, expecting to find the Donner Party on the western side of the mountain. When they arrived in the valley, just along the Bear River below the steep approach to Emigrant Gap, they found only a pioneer couple, migrants who had been separated from their company, both nearing starvation. 2 guides deserted Reed and McCutcheon with some of their horses, but pressed on farther up the valley to Yuba Bottoms, walking the last mile on foot. Reed and McCutcheon stood looking up at Emigrant Gap, only 19 kilometers from the top. The path was blocked by snow, and they were forced to turn back. Much of the military in California were engaged in the Mexican-American War, and with them, the able-bodied men. For example, Colonel Fremont's personnel were occupied at that precise time in capturing Santa Barbara. Throughout the region, roads were blocked, communications compromised, and supplies unavailable. Only 3 men responded to a call for volunteers to rescue the Donner Party, and Reed was laid over in San Jose until February because of regional uprisings and general confusion. The people of San Jose responded by creating a petition to appeal to the US Navy to assist the people at Truckee Lake. 2 local newspapers reported that members of the Snowshoe Party had resorted to cannibalism, which helped to foster sympathy for those who were still trapped. Residents of Yerba Buena, many of them recent migrants, managed to raise $1,300, amounting to $40,800 as of 2022, and organize relief efforts to build 2 camps to supply a rescue party for the refugees. On February 4, a rescue party including William Eddy started out from the Sacramento Valley. Rain and a swollen river forced several delays. Eddy stationed himself at Bear Valley, while the others made steady progress through the snow and storms to cross into Truckee Lake. They cached their food at stations along the way so as to reduce their load, with 3 members of the party eventually turning back and 7 forging on. On February 18, the rescue party scaled Fremont Pass, now known as Donner Pass. As they neared where Eddy told them the cabins would be, they began to shout for anyone who might hear them. Mrs. Murphy appeared from a hole in the snow, stared at them, and asked, "Are you men from California, or do you come from heaven?" The party doled out food in small portions so as to prevent the survivors from eating themselves to death. All the cabins were buried in snow. The oxide roofs were completely soaked and had begun rotting, emitting an overpowering stench. 13 people at the camps were dead, and their bodies had been loosely buried in the snow near the cabin roofs. 3 members of the rescue party pushed forward to where the Donners were and brought back 4 gaunt children and 3 adults. George Donner's arm was so gangrenous he could not move, and Leanna Donner had particular difficulty walking up the steep incline from Alder Creek to Truckee Lake, later writing, "Such pain and misery as I endured that day is beyond description." 23 people were chosen to go with the rescue party, leaving 21 in the cabins at Truckee Lake and 12 at Alder Creek. The rescuers concealed the fate of the snowshoe party, informing the migrants only that they did not return because they were frostbitten. Patty and Tommy Reed were soon too weak to cross the snowdrifts, and no one was strong enough to carry them. Margaret Reed faced the agonizing predicament of accompanying her 2 older children to Bear Valley and watching her 2 frailest be taken back to Truckee Lake without a parent. She made one of the rescuers swear on his honor as a Mason that he would return for her children. Upon their return to the lake, the Breens flatly refused them entry to their cabin, but after they promised to leave more food, the children were grudgingly admitted. The rescue party was dismayed to find that the first food cache they had left had been broken into by animals, leaving them without food for 4 days. After struggling over the pass, John Denton slipped into a coma and died. Ada Kesselberg died soon afterwards, leaving her mother inconsolable and unable to let her child's body go. After several days more travel through difficult country, the party grew concerned that the children would not survive. Some of them even ate the buckskin fringe from one of the rescuers' pants and the shoelaces of another. On their way down from the mountains, they met the next rescue party, which included James Reed. Upon hearing his voice, Margaret collapsed and sank into the snow, overwhelmed and exhausted. After the first group of survivors made it safely into Bear Valley, William Hook, Jacob Donner's stepson, broke into their food stores and fatally gorged himself. The others continued to Sutter's Fort. Around the same time as the first relief party was being organised, nearby California settler and patriarch George C. Yunt had previously heard of the plight of the Donner Party, and along with Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo and several others, managed to raise $500 to send out a second party. By March 1, the second party had reached Truckee Lake. The rescuers here included veteran mountain men, most notably John Turner, who accompanied the return of Reed and McCutcheon. An inspection of the Breen cabin found its occupants relatively well, but the Murphy cabin was described as having passed the limits of description and almost of imagination. Lavina Murphy was caring for her 8-year-old son Simon and the 2 young children of William, Eddie, and Foster. She had deteriorated mentally and was nearly blind. The children were listless and had not been cleaned in days. Louis Kesselberg had moved into the cabin and could barely move himself due to an injured leg. No one at Truckee Lake had died during the interim between the departure of the first party and the arrival of the second. Patrick Breen documented a disturbing visit in the last week of February from Mrs. Murphy, who said her family was considering eating Milt Elliott, with Reed and McCutcheon later finding Elliott's mutilated body. The Alder Creek camp fared no better. The first 2 members of the relief party to reach it saw Trudeau carrying a human leg. When they made their presence known, he threw it into a hole in the snow that was found to contain the mostly dismembered body of Jacob Donner. Inside the tent, Elizabeth Donner had refused to eat, although her children were being nourished by their father's organs. The rescuers discovered 3 other bodies had already been consumed, and in the other tent, found Tamsin Donner well, with George having fallen ill due to infection. The team evacuated 17 migrants from Truckee Lake, only 3 of whom were adults. Both the Breen and Graves families prepared themselves for travel, with only 5 people now remaining at the camps, including Kesselberg, Mrs. Murphy and her son Simon, and the young Eddie and Foster children. Tamsin Donner elected to stay with her ailing husband after Reed informed her that a third party was en route. Mrs. Donner kept her daughters Eliza, Georgia, and Frances with her. The walk back to Bear Valley was very slow. At one point, Reed sent 2 men ahead to retrieve the first cache of food, expecting relief led by Salim E. Woodworth, but a violent blizzard arose after they scaled the pass. 5-year-old Isaac Donner froze to death shortly after, and Reed also nearly succumbed to the cold. Mary Donner's feet were badly burned, because she was so frostbitten she did not realize she was laying with them across the campfire while she slept. When the storm finally passed, the Breen and Graves families were too apathetic and exhausted to get up and move, not having eaten for days. The relief party had no choice but to leave without them. The site where the Breens and Graves had been left became known as Starved Camp. Margaret Breen reportedly took the initiative to try to keep the members of the camp alive after the others departed down the mountain. However, Elizabeth Graves and her son Franklin perished before the next rescue party could reach them, and the remaining survivors resorted to eating the flesh from the dead bodies. 3 members of the relief party stayed to help those remaining at the camps, with Charles Stone at Truckee Lake and Charles Cady and Nicholas Clark at Alder Creek. While Clark was out hunting, Stone travelled to Alder Creek and made plans with Katie to return to California. Tams and Donna arranged for them to take her daughters Eliza, Georgia, and Frances with them for a payment. Stone and Katie took the three girls to Truckee Lake, but left them at a cabin with Kesselberg and Lavina Murphy when they started out toward Bear Valley. Katie recalled later that after 2 days on the trail, they noted and passed Starved Camp, but did not stop to help. They overtook Reed and the others fairly quickly, and several days later at the Alder Creek camp, Clark and Trudeau agreed to also leave for California together. When they arrived at Truckee Lake and discovered the Donner girls still there, they returned to Alder Creek to inform Tams and Donna. William Foster and Eddie, survivors of the original snowshoe party, started out from Bear Valley to intercept Reed, taking with them a man named John Stark. After a day, they found Reed helping his children struggle on toward Bear Valley, all of them frostbitten and bleeding, but alive. Desperate to rescue their own families, Foster and Eddie persuaded 4 men with pleading and money to go to Truckee Lake with them. During their journey, they had found the 11 survivors at Starved Camp, huddled around a fire that had sunk into a pit of snow. The relief party split up, with Foster, Eddie, and 2 others headed onwards to the lake, and the other 2 taking one of the children each back to Bear Valley, hoping to save at least some of the remaining group. John Stark refused to leave the other survivors. He picked up 2 children and all the provisions and assisted the remaining Breens and Graves to safety, taking the children further down the path, leaving them ahead, then turning back to guide the rest. Foster and Eddie finally arrived at Truckee Lake on March 14, where they found their children dead. Kesselberg told Eddie that he had eaten the remains of Eddie's son, and Eddie swore to murder Kesselberg if they ever met in California. George Donner and one of Jacob Donner's children were still alive at Alder Creek. Tamsin Donner had just arrived at the Murphy cabin to see her daughters. She could have walked out alone, but chose to return to her husband, despite the reality of there being no relief party arriving anytime soon. Foster and Eddie and the rest of the Third Relief left with the Donner girls, young Simon Murphy, Trudeau, and Clark. Lavina Murphy was too weak to move, and Kesselberg refused to leave. 2 more relief parties were mustered to evacuate any remaining adults who might still be alive. Unfortunately, both turned back before getting even to Bear Valley, and no further attempts were made to brave the mountain pass. On April 10, almost a month since the Third Relief had left Truckee Lake, the Spanish municipal magistrate near Sutter's Fort organised a salvage party to recover what they could of the Donners' belongings. Those would be sold, with a part of the proceeds going towards the orphaned children. The salvage party found the Alder Creek tents empty, except for the body of George Donner, who had died only days earlier. On their way back to Truckee Lake, they found Louis Kesselberg alive. According to him, Mrs. Murphy had died a week after the departure of the Third Relief. Some weeks later, Tamsin Donner had arrived at his cabin on her way over the pass, soaked and visibly upset. Kesselberg said he put a blanket around her and told her to start out in the morning, but she died during the night. The salvage party was suspicious of Kesselberg's story and found a pot full of human flesh in the cabin, along with George Donner's pistols, some jewelry, and $250 in gold. They threatened to lynch Kesselberg, who confessed that he had cached $273 of the Donner's money, supposedly at Tamsin's suggestion, so that it could one day benefit her children. News of the Donner Party's fate was spread eastward by Samuel Brennan, an elder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and a journalist who ran into the salvage party as they came down from the pass with Kesselberg. Accounts of the ordeal first reached New York City in July 1847. Reporting on the event across the US was heavily influenced by the national enthusiasm for westward migration. In some papers, news of the tragedy was buried in small paragraphs, despite the contemporary tendency to sensationalize stories. Several papers, including those in California, wrote about the cannibalism in graphic, exaggerated detail, with others depicting the members of the Donner Party as heroes, and California itself a paradise worth of significant sacrifices. Emigration to the West decreased over the following years, but it is likely that the drop in numbers was caused more by the fears over the outcome of the Mexican-American War than the cautionary tale of the Donner Party. In 1846, an estimated 1,500 people migrated to California, with the number decreasing to 450 in 1847 and 400 in 1848. The California gold rush spurred a sharp increase, however, and 1849 saw approximately 25,000 people make the journey west. Most of the overland migration followed the Carson River, though some groups used the same route as the Donner Party and recorded their observations along the way. In late June 1847, members of the Mormon Battalion under General Stephen Kearny buried the human remains and partially burned 2 of the cabins. The few who ventured over the pass in the next few years found bones, other artifacts, and the cabin used by the Reed and Graves families. In 1891, a cache of money was found buried by the lake. It was thought to have been stored by Mrs. Graves, who hastily hid it when she left with the Second Relief, hoping to return to it later. Lansford Hastings received several death threats, with a migrant who had crossed just prior to the Donner Party confronting him about the difficulties they encountered, and reporting, of course, he could say nothing but that he was very sorry and that he meant well. Of the 87 people who entered the Wasatch Mountains, 48 survived. 5 people had already died before they arrived at Truckee Lake, with a further 34 dying between December 1846 and April 1847, the count settling at 25 males and 9 females. Only the Reed and Breen families remained intact, with the children of Jacob and George Donner and Franklin Graves now orphaned. William Eddy was alone, and most of the Murphy family had died. Only 3 mules reached California, and most of the Donner Party's possessions were discarded. And that is the sordid and tragic tale of the Donner Party. Pioneers belonging to a generation faced with adversity and uncertainty at the top of every berm and the end of every road. With so many rumors and reports released, and many fantastical stories told about the events that befell them, most exaggerating horrific details and muddying the waters of truth, it is fortunate that we have at least some reliable reports of the actual events. Author George R. Stewart writes, "The cannibalism, although it might also be called a minor episode, has become, in the popular mind, the chief fact to be remembered about the Donner Party. For a taboo always allures with as great strength as it repels." Don't forget, I stream 4 days a week over at twitch.tv/Jabberwocky, that's JAYBBERWOCKY. You can also show your support and help out the podcast by heading to patreon.com/Jabberwocky and signing up for one of the member tiers listed. Make sure to keep a weather eye out for announcements regarding future episodes. @HangnailPod is the official Twitter for the podcast, and all announcements will appear there. Thank you all for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I'll see you next time.